This is building the shed behind the shop. I have these stacks of slabs of wood that I've cut over the years. I don't have too many, but there just isn't a good place to keep them. Right now, many of them are under our back deck, which could be usable as a nice space to hang out outside, but it's full of wood slabs. There's a space behind the shop that every so often we attack the overgrown plants and try and clear out with the idea of doing something in this space. I used it for firewood for a long time, and I've had the idea for a long time to build a sort of open shed in this space to store all of the outside shop things. So basically the big stacks of wood and other smaller bits of wood that I don't really want to keep in the shop, as well as sort of long things like ladders and pole saws and spare 2x4s and sort of all that kind of stuff could go back here. So we finally got it fairly cleared out, and I had the kids help rake the leaves and the last bit of soft material on the ground. You can sort of see the space here behind the shop. The first thing I wanted to do, because the ground slopes from one end of the shop to the other, was to cut away a little bit at the high end and put that soil at the low end. So we'd flatten the grade out just a little bit. Doing this by hand was kind of a lot of work. I think having a small excavator or loader would have helped. But we did get a few inches of grade change, which will help. And it got us down to more solid earth as well. I wanted to make some footings for the new shed. So I grew up in Hawaii, and I think this is where this is coming from a little bit. In Hawaii, many of the houses are on a double cinder block footing, where you have a approximately 16-inch square cinder block and I think about a 6-inch square block sitting on top of that. Then your post for the house sits on top of that. And there really isn't a poured foundation. And as I didn't really want this shed to feel permanent, I wanted it to feel more like a piece of furniture sitting behind the shop. So I wanted to have a light touch as it touched the ground. So my idea was to make a bigger square footing on the ground and then a smaller block for the post for the shed to sit on. So I made a frame for that lower footing piece, and we laid out where those were going to go. After all of these were laid, I really should have spent more time laying them out more precisely. I thought I had more play in the dimensions than I really did in the end. So I found out that you really can't get the big cinder blocks that I wanted here. Okay, so the idea is to make a hole. I'm going to put gravel, like 4-6 inches of gravel in it. And then that'll go on top, and we'll pour a little concrete and put a paver on there. That would give me a good footing for the block that the post fits into. Here's one of the holes being dug. I went and got a scoop of gravel and started putting that in the holes, mostly guessing at how much should go in. The height wasn't very critical. I had Calvin cut some wire mesh to go in the concrete to help with the reinforcing. And we used the frame that I made for the concrete to make sure the wire mesh pieces were small enough to fit within the frame. And it's a little too big. We packed down the gravel. This worked fairly well. Probably not as well as a compactor, but I think this will be okay. I showed the kids how to mix concrete. We figured out a better way to open the bags after this, where you split the middle and then just pull the bag out of the wheelbarrow and all the concrete stays behind. We figured out how much water to add for one bag.
Oh, yeah. Should I go wash? Yeah, I should probably wash.
And we measured out the water. And it was just slightly not enough. So in future batches, we added just a little bit more water. But it was nice being able to do a bag and then put in exactly the right amount of water and have it come out to the right consistency. So we put a little concrete in the frame. We would get the frame as level as we could. Then a piece of the wire mesh. Then some more concrete. It feels pretty dry at this point, but once you start sort of packing it down, it kind of liquefies and feels more like it should. Getting this part level was tricky, as I was mostly just eyeballing it, and I get it pretty close. A couple of the pavers I had to pull out and move the concrete around because it just wasn't close enough to level. Patting it down like this also gets it into all of the corners of the frame. And I can put a paver in and then check if it's level. And as long as it's pretty close, it'll be okay. The footings I did near the shop, I did a 3-sided frame and did a light stake around that frame to sort of hold it in place. I thought these were going to be hard to get apart and off of the concrete, but it was actually really easy. I could just take one side off and then the rest of it slipped off the concrete. And the ones by the shop wall were really easy to come out. Just pull the stakes out and then the frame just came right off. I just had to make one frame that went all the way around and one frame that was on 3 sides. And I could just reuse those over and over again. Then I set the blocks next to the shop so that they were all the same distance from the shop. I used the shop wall as the datum for the shed project. I just assumed the shop wall was straight and plumb. Then I went and got most of the wood for the project, which didn't seem like very much, but it ended up being just fine. I made some temporary frames to hold the posts in place while we put those up. So these frames will hold the pair of posts at the right distance apart and will hold them up, as I'll put the posts in first. I didn't find anything that was exactly like what I was trying to build, but I think another way that this might be typically done would be to build the floor as a deck and have the posts only come up to hold that floor. Then build the walls and the roof on that deck. So there'd sort of be a separation at the floor height. Whereas I was building something where the posts run all the way from the ground all the way up to the roof. As I really didn't want walls, I wanted an open structure with a floor and a roof. I cut some strips that I will actually reuse later, but I can use them to hold the column pairs in place and plumb. So as I attached this stake, I had Calvin make sure it was plumb or vertical. Once we had one pair in place, we could do the next pair. And they were fairly straightforward. I could attach my frame to one side, then lift that into place and attach it to the other column. And the kids could help hold the columns vertical once they were up, as that really wasn't very hard. It just had to be kept in place, which was a huge help. I really wouldn't have been able to do this without them helping. So you can see the second one going up. Then for the third, fourth, and fifth one, I got Bonnie and Calvin to help. And we got faster at this point. This is the last one going into place. This tree needs to be trimmed a little bit. Because the height of the footings was random, I couldn't make the pairs of columns on the ground and then tilt them into place. as they needed to be sort of built vertically and in place so that the footing heights would be accounted for. The next thing I did was to tie the footings together with a 2x4. The real function of this is to be a ledge that the main beams will sit on and take the weight from the beams. And once things are together, I put bolts through the 2x4s and the columns. So they're held together better than just the screws that I'm using in the beginning. And I just went down and put all of these 2x4s in this way. This will allow me to have the beams flush with the outside of the posts and still be structural enough to hold the weight of the wood slabs. At least that's the idea. The first beam I put in, I tried putting the joist hangers on first and using the wrong screws at this point. And this ended up not really being the best way to do this. I ended up just putting all the beams in without the joist hangers, then coming in and doing the joists in a different method, which I'll show here in a minute. The beams are held in place with an L bracket between the column and the beam, and they rest on the 2x4 that's bolted to the post. So this method might not be the most orthodox, but it gives me a nice flush detail between the beam and the post. I can start working on the joists now. I ended up with joists that were just a hair under 4 feet. So with my 8-foot 2x6s, I had just a tiny little bit of waste, which was nice. So the method I ended up using with the joists was to attach a piece of wood to each end of the joist with a screw. Then I could put the joist in place. I had marks for where those were going on the beam. I could then clamp the pieces of wood in place, and this will hold the joist and the beam absolutely flush. Then I can attach the joist hanger. There are little tabs that hold it in place before you put the nails in. I found it was good to put the top 2 nails in first, as sometimes the little tabs come out. So it's good to sort of tap in both of the top 2 nails, and then do the rest of the nails. The attachments into the joists, I use screws. I figured the weight is being held by the nails that attach the joist hangers to the beam, and the screws are just holding the joists in place. So they don't need to be as strong. So I just went through and did all of the joists. So the floor is mostly done at this point, and I can start working on the roof. I measured the shop roof angle at 7 degrees. So I used that on the shed, and I started to work out what shape roof beam I was going to cut. So the idea is to have a 2x6 on each side of the column pairs, and between those I'll run 2x6 joists across each bay of the shed. I got one of the roof beams in place and decided what I should make is a frame at that angle and height so I could put all of the roof beams in the same place really easily. So I made that frame based on the first beam that I put in, and I took all that out to the shop to put it together once I had the sizes right, and I could make it nice and flat in the shop and get the joints nice and tight. Then I left one of the connections on the cross piece off at this point, and I took the frame out to the shed and clamped it in exactly the location that I needed it and put that last screw in, and that would hold it in exactly the shape that I needed. Now I could make the rest of the roof beams. I angled the back, or the high side of the beam, and I cut that on the miter saw. On the low side, or the front side of the beam, I cut off a piece to make the nose of the beam a little narrower. And I did this on the big radial arm saw. For the roof beams, I did want to add the joist hangers. So I laid out where those were going to go, and I made a little section of roof joists and would clamp that in place and then attach the joist hanger. And I just used screws for these. So this is laying out one pair of roof beams. And you can see how this goes up now. I can just put it on my frame and attach it. I started with screws, and once everything was together, I ran a bolt through the connection between the beam and the posts. So I'm hoping that's good enough or strong enough to hold everything in place. So this is the other side going in. This is when it had gotten kind of smoky here from the wildfires. I did this for about 2 days and then decided I really shouldn't be outside and went in for a few days and took a little bit of a break. Breathing in the air just wasn't good. I attached the first brace to the back of the shed that'll hold that first pair of posts in place. I figured I should do that before I start putting the joists across the bay of the shed. I trimmed the top edge of the joists to the 7-degree angle of the roof, so the joists can be vertical and the top edge of the joist will be flush with the top of the beam on the roof. So having the joist hangers in place first made it easier to put the joists in, as I could just drop them in place. The first bay, the back posts were a little far apart, so I got out one of my big clamps and pulled the bay together, and the joists went into place. And I cut all the joists at the same length so that the bay would be the same width across the depth of the bay. Then I just screwed the joists in place. This is doing the next bay. I got Calvin to help a little bit, which was nice because it's one of those things where you're working up on the ladder. So having a assistant who can pass you things is really, really helpful. So you're not going up and down the ladder 1,000 times. This is doing the third bay. It's more fun watching the clouds than watching me, I think. I think this is the last bay, which is also the tallest part of the roof, or the furthest distance from the floor to the roof. I have the floor step down with the grade, so the bay furthest down the length of the shop is also the tallest, as the roof stays at the same height. And I need to clean the gutter out on the shop. And I can start to add the screws for the joists. Next, I wanted a 2x4 at the nose of the roof. So it's the fascia piece, I guess you could call it, for the roof. I attached some scrap pieces of wood so that piece would sit on the beams. Then I could just screw it in place. And this went out pretty easily. I left the end of the two ends a little bit long, and I will cut those off later. On the two ends of the roof, I want to have a little bit of an eave or a little bit of a cantilever of the roof beyond the columns. So I made a roof beam and attached a bunch of outriggers to it that will help hold the roof a little bit beyond the column line. And I cut the angle into those outriggers with the miter saw. And I drilled holes in the roof beam. So I'll attach the outriggers with screws from the inside. And I found actual construction screws. I figured that would work better than the deck screws I've been using. So you can see this is the other side of the outer pair on the columns. and outriggers fall where the joists fall. And I can use my frame again to put this in place. It was kind of nice as well that where it was placed was exactly where it touches the fascia piece. And I can put a fascia piece on this piece, which also just connects with the fascia along the front of the shop. Something I wanted to do before I was climbing around on the roof was to add some of the structural pieces to the inside of the shed. I wanted to make a triangle between the roof beams and the posts. So I cut a 4x4 post. And you can see how that's going to attach. I'll attach it to a column with a bolt, and then a bolt between the two beams and the new cross piece. And this will hopefully give the structure a little more stiffness as I'm making a triangle. So at the top, I can just run a bolt between the beams and the cross piece. I cut off the fascia piece at the corner once it was in place. And I cut off the height of the posts that I didn't need. I'd run these tall, and now that the roof is in place, I can just cut them off flush with the top of the roof. So I didn't have to measure the posts or get them perfect when we were trying to put them up. And the height of the footings didn't really matter, because I just have this extra bit of post at the top I can cut off. Now I wanted to start putting the roof surface on. So I got some plastic corrugated roofing, which I think you can just put onto the frame of whatever structure you're putting it on. But I thought it'd be nice to give the structure a little more stiffness by adding some OSB material to the roof as sort of a big stiff membrane to hold the roof together. I laid it out so I could use a full sheet at the front end of the roof and a half sheet at the back end by the shop. I started getting it up and then realized I had to cut the columns off. This all worked nicely, except I didn't quite have enough. I was one sheet short and couldn't quite do the end and had to do that the next day. So I could get up and just attach these to the joists and beams below. I made a stick with marks on it for where the joists were, so I could put the screws down into the joists. I cut the fascia piece off the other end. Then I could start working on the corrugated roofing. I got 12-foot pieces that I could cut down to 6-foot pieces, which is exactly what I needed. I tried using the circular saw to cut the roofing pieces, and this worked, but I wouldn't recommend it. It kind of chipped it. Not so much that I couldn't use it, but it wasn't a very clean cut. Maybe there's a better blade for this, or maybe do it a completely different way. So the idea has been that the roof will slip up under the gutter of the shop. So it won't really seal, but at least rain won't get in between the shed and the shop. At least that's the hope. If I end up having an issue with that, I'm thinking I could get a piece of flashing to go in front of the shop gutter and onto the shed roof to make more of a rain seal. But so far it's been okay in the rain that we've had. This roofing was somewhat tricky to go up. When I was on the roof it went fine, but then the front didn't quite line up right. But it seems to be okay, and no one really sees it, so I'm not really a roofer. So I got it done just in time for the rain to start. And it rained quite a bit. And it seems to work. The roof doesn't leak. In that rain, I realized a gutter would probably be a good idea. As it's corrugated, you get these streams of water off of the roof that come down in the ground and then splash all of the structure of the shed. When I started to work on that, I realized my fascia piece, I didn't cut at an angle, so it wasn't vertical. and it felt like the gutter really wanted to be hung on a vertical fascia piece. So I made some wedged pieces out of some leftover cedar that I had, and I attached those to the front of the roof. And that wedge would make the fascia that I attached the gutter to really close to vertical. And it looks a tiny bit nicer. Now, I'm not a framer, and I'm definitely not a roofer, but I'm really, really not a gutter installer. This was hard, and I don't think I did a very good job. It does seem to work, but I won't really show a whole lot of it, as I don't know that it would really be helpful for anyone. It was basically putting up clips, then putting the gutter in place, and then attaching the gutter from above with the gutter clips. Then I could put the bolts in for a lot of the structure, which was just a lot of time screwing holes and putting bolts in them. The back wall of the shed, I made sort of a truss with triangles between the posts and the floor beams. So I'm hoping to put a little more of the weight on the back side of the shed, which is also a little more away from the rain and the weather. But also it gives that beam along the back side a lot of strength. So one thing I wanted to do, and I'm not sure that this is really that necessary, but because I was going to stack slabs of wood on this floor, I wanted to add a little strip on top of the pressure-treated lumber. So I cut the strips that I had used to support the columns earlier into shorter strips, and I could lay those on the floor. And the floor is just going to be open, so there'll be some airflow. I really don't need a floor there if I'm just going to stack slabs on top of it. So we could start to move some of the wood. I got Calvin to help with the first batch. Then I got my neighbor friend Jeff to help with the stuff that we did the second day. So the first batch is some maple, and the stuff in the middle is the walnut I did with my friend Gabe. And then on the end, we put the big sequoia slabs that I have left from working with my friend Brian.
Good? Yeah. Woo! All right.
And that's about how it's looking. So the idea is really an open structure, and it's just a big platform with a roof over it. I do hope in the coming weeks, possibly month, to get some open mesh material custom made to fit into the opening, so I can sort of hang a curtain around the outside of the shed, which will help keep the sun and maybe a little bit of the moisture out. And I'm kind of thinking the bay on the end I might enclose and actually make that into a shed, and I can use that for smaller pieces of wood and maybe lawn tools and that kind of stuff. Thanks for watching.